All right, settle in, folks, because you are not gonna believe this one. I'm telling you what my family went through, what I went through. Well, it's the kind of thing you see in those daytime television dramas, not something that happens to regular folks like us. And it all started with my 101-year-old grandpa. Yeah, you heard that right, 101. Fella was tougher than a $2 steak. But what he did and what he left behind in that mysterious suitcase, well, stick with me to the very end. Because what this man, my own grandfather, managed to hide for nearly a century will leave you absolutely speechless. I swear on my mother's grave, this story is one for the books. My Grandpa Joe, now he was a character. Born in, well, he always said 1920-something, but the math never quite added up perfectly, you know? He was spry for his age, right up until the end, or what we thought was the end. He lived in that same little clapboard house on Elm Street for over 60 years. Grandma Rose, bless her heart, she passed on a good 15 years before all this craziness started. And Grandpa, well, he just kept on keeping on. He had his routine, you see. Up at dawn, coffee black as tar. Read the paper front to back, even if it was mostly ads by then. Then he'd potter in his little garden, fussing over his tomatoes like they were his own children. My son, Michael, and we'd take turns checking in on him, making sure he had his groceries, that his meds were sorted. He was stubborn, mind you, independent as a hog on ice, but at 101, even he had to admit he needed a little help now and then. It was a Tuesday, I remember, because Tuesdays were Michael's day to pop over. He called me around lunchtime, voice tight as a banjo string. "Dad," he said, "Grandpa's not here." Now that wasn't entirely unheard of. Sometimes Joe'd wander down to the corner, store for a licorice whip or to shoot the breeze with old man Henderson, who was only a spry 92 himself. "Did you check Henderson's?" I asked. "Yeah, Dad," Michael said. "And the store and the park. His coffee cup's cold on the counter, papers, still folded. It's like he just vanished." Now, I'm not one to panic, not usually. Back in my day, you learned to keep a cool head. But 101 years old, vanished? Lord have mercy, a chill went down my spine, colder than a witch's kiss in January. I told Michael I was on my way, and you best believe I broke a few speed limits getting over to Elm Street. The house was quiet, too quiet. It felt empty, like the soul had been sucked right out of it. We called the police, of course. They were respectful, but you could see it in their eyes. An old fella probably wandered off, disoriented. They put out a silver alert, said they'd do their best. We searched, me, Michael, my daughter Sarah, even her kids, bless their hearts, though they were more underfoot than helpful. We scoured the neighborhood, checked the hospitals, the shelters. Nothing. It was like Grandpa Joe had just evaporated into thin air. Days turned into a week. The police scaled back their active search. Hope started to feel like a fool's game. We were bracing ourselves for the worst, you know, thinking maybe he'd, found a quiet place to lay his head for the last time. It was Sarah, my daughter, who found it. We were going through Grandpa's things, a grim task, trying to decide what to do, what to keep. She was in his bedroom closet, a place that always smelled faintly of mothballs and old wool. "Dad," she called out, her voice muffled. "You should see this." I went in, and there, tucked way in the back under a pile of old army blankets I hadn't seen in 50 years, was a suitcase. Not just any suitcase. This thing was ancient, hard-sided, covered in what looked like worn brown leather. With brass clasps tarnished green with age, it looked like something out of an old black-and-white movie. I'd never seen it before in my life. "Think he packed a bag?" Michael asked, his voice hopeful for a split second. But this thing looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. It was heavy, too. Real heavy. "What in the Sam Hill?" I muttered, dragging it out. It was locked, of course. 2 sturdy clasps and a central lock that looked like it would need a skeleton key. We didn't have one of those just lying around. Michael, always the practical one, went out to the shed and came back with a pry bar and a heavy-duty screwdriver. "You sure about this, Dad?" he asked. Feels wrong somehow. Son, I said, my voice rougher than I intended. Your grandpa's missing. Maybe there's something in here that'll tell us where he went. Or why. It felt like a long shot, a desperate one. But what else did we have? It took a good 10 minutes of grunting and sweating, and I was worried we'd break the darn thing beyond repair. But finally, with a sickening crack, one of the clasps gave way. Then the other. The main lock, well, that just sort of crumbled under the pressure. My heart was pounding like a drum solo. What were we about to find? Old love letters from Grandma Rose? His discharge papers from the war he never talked much about, maybe, just maybe, a clue to his disappearance. Michael and I exchanged a look. Sarah stood by the door, hand over her mouth. I took a deep breath and lifted the lid. It creaked open like a coffin. And inside, well, it wasn't what any of us expected. No clothes, no personal mementos, not at first glance. It was filled, almost to the brim, with stacks and stacks of old, yellowed papers tied neatly with string. And on top of the first bundle, almost like it was placed there deliberately, was a photograph. A studio portrait, stiff and formal, of a young woman I'd never seen before in my entire life, holding a small baby. She was beautiful, in a sad sort of way, with dark, haunted eyes. And on the back, in faded, spidery handwriting, was a name, Annalise, and below it a single cryptic word in a language I didn't recognize. My blood ran cold. Who in the blazes was Annalise, and what did she have to do with my Grandpa Joe? I tell you, if you think this is a shocker, you just wait. This was only the beginning of a rabbit hole that went deeper than the Grand Canyon. Lord have mercy, that photograph hit me like a punch to the gut. Annalise. The name echoed in my head. I'd known Grandpa Joe my whole life, or so I thought. I knew his stories, his little quirks, the way he hummed off key when he was concentrating. But this woman, this baby, they were a complete blank. Who is she, Dad? Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. I don't have the foggiest idea, I managed, my voice barely a croak. This wasn't just some old flame, the baby in her arms suggested. Something far more permanent. Could my grandpa, the quiet, unassuming man who doted on Grandma Rose, have had a whole other life we knew nothing about? The thought was staggering, like finding out the sky wasn't blue. We carefully lifted out that first bundle of papers. They were letters, dozens of them, the envelopes brittle and the stamps foreign. The script was elegant, looping, but also in that same unfamiliar language as the word on the back of the photo. We need to get these translated, Michael said, stating the obvious. But by who? And what if it's something we don't want to know? That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? Sometimes ignorance truly is bliss. But Grandpa, Joe was missing. And this suitcase, these letters, this mysterious Annalise, they felt like the only thread we had. Over the next few days, while the police continued their now routine and frankly fruitless inquiries about Grandpa, we embarked on our own investigation. Michael, being younger and savvier with that whole internet contraption, found a local university professor who specialized in old European languages. Professor Davies was a kindly, bespectacled woman, probably in her late 50s, and she agreed to look at a few samples. We scanned some of the letters in the back of the photograph and emailed them over, my fingers trembling as I hit send. What secrets were about to be unearthed? Was Grandpa Joe a spy, a war hero with a hidden past, or something darker? My mind reeled with possibilities, each one more outlandish than the last. Professor Davies called back 2 days later. Mr. Henderson, she said, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. The language on the photograph and in the letters is German. The word under Annalise is meine Frau. It means my wife. My wife. Nearly dropped the phone. Grandpa Joe had been married to Grandma Rose for over 50 years before she passed. They'd met after the war, he always said. Or at least that's the story we'd always been told. And the letters, Professor? I asked, my throat dry. They are. Well, they are love letters, Mr. Henderson. written from a man named Joseph to his wife Annalise and their young son Klaus. They speak of hardship, of longing, of hope for a future together. The early ones are dated in the late 1930s from Germany. Then there's a gap, and then a few, much more desperate, from the mid-1940s, from what appears to be a displaced persons camp after the war. A displaced persons camp. Joseph. Not Joe. Klaus. A son. My grandpa had a son we never knew about. It was like a dam broke inside me. All those years, all those family dinners, Christmases, birthdays. Had he been carrying this secret, this other family, in his heart? The betrayal, even though it was ancient history, felt fresh, raw. How could he? How could he have lived a lie for so long? And Grandma Rose, did she know? Was her whole life with him built on a foundation of secrets? The question swirled in my head, making me dizzy. Professor Davies continued, the later letters are very sad. Joseph writes of searching for Annalise and Klaus, of finding no trace of them after the chaos of the war's end. He fears the worst. The last letter we have in this bundle is dated 1947. He writes that he has an opportunity to emigrate to America, to start anew. Though his heart is broken, he says he will never forget them, that he will carry their memory forever. So, Grandpa, Joe wasn't just Joe. He was Joseph, a German immigrant. He'd never spoken a word of German in my hearing, not once. He'd always claimed to be from somewhere vague, up north. A story so flimsy I can't believe none of us ever questioned it. Harder. Back in my day, you didn't pry too much into a man's past, especially if he'd been through the war. You just accepted him for who he was in the present. But this changed everything. The suitcase held more than just letters. As we delved deeper, we found a small, tarnished silver locket. Inside, one side was empty, clearly meant for a picture. The other held a tiny, faded snippet of dark hair, fine as silk. Whose hair? Annalise's? Young Klaus's? There was also a worn, leather-bound journal, also in German. This, Professor Davies said, would take longer to translate. And then, at the very bottom, beneath everything, was a small, velvet-lined box. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside, nestled on the faded velvet, was an iron cross, a German military decoration from World War II. Lord have mercy. My grandfather, the man who tended his roses and told silly jokes to his great-grandkids, had fought for Germany in the war. This wasn't just a secret family. This was a secret identity, a secret past that rewrote everything we thought we knew about him. The quiet, unassuming American grandpa was a facade. What else had he hidden? And why, after all these years, was this secret now coming to light? Was his disappearance connected to this? Had someone from his past found him? The implications were terrifying. Michael, ever the pragmatist, started looking into immigration records from the late 1940s. If he came here as Joseph, he reasoned, there has to be a paper trail, maybe even a change of name. Sarah, meanwhile, was devastated. Grandma Rose, she kept saying. Did she ever know? How could he do that to her? I didn't have any answers. I felt like I was walking through a fog. The world tilted on its axis. My own father, Grandpa Joe's son with Grandma Rose, had passed away 10 years ago. What would he have thought of all this? Then Michael struck gold, or something that looked like it. Dad, look at this. He'd found a passenger manifest from a ship arriving in New York in late 1947. On it, a Joseph Gruber. Age listed as 27. Place of origin, a DP camp in Allied-occupied Germany. And then, a few years later, a record of a name change application. In Pennsylvania, Joseph Gruber to Joseph Joe Henderson. Henderson was Grandma Rose's maiden name. He hadn't just taken a new first name, he'd taken her entire family name, erasing Joseph Gruber completely. The journal was the next piece. Professor Davies worked on it diligently. She'd call with updates, her voice tinged with a mix of academic curiosity and human sympathy. Joseph's journal detailed his early life, his love for Annalise, the birth of Klaus. Then the war, the horrors he witnessed, the things he was forced to do. He wasn't a Nazi ideologue, it seemed, just a young man caught in the gears of a terrible machine. He wrote of being separated from Anneliese and Klaus during an Allied bombing raid near the end of the war. He'd searched desperately, frantically. He'd heard rumors they'd been on a train that was hit, that there were no survivors. He'd mourned them, truly believed them dead. Coming to America was his attempt to escape the ghosts. Marrying Grandma Rose, starting a new family. It was a chance to build a life out of the ashes of his old one. But the journal entries, even, years later, were filled with a quiet, persistent grief for Anneliese and Klaus. He'd never forgotten them. Never. And then Professor Davies called with a piece of information that made my blood run colder than a January well. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice hushed, "the last few entries in the journal are recent, very recent, within the last 6 months." My heart hammered. "What do they say, Professor?" I urged. He writes that he received a letter. From Germany, he says, after all these years, a miracle or a curse. He mentions a name, a lawyer it seems, and then he writes, "Klaus is alive." Klaus, his son, was alive after all these years, and Grandpa Joe knew. My mind raced. If Klaus was alive, could Anneliese be too? Or was this Klaus reaching out, having somehow found his long-lost father? The questions were a storm in my head, and the most pressing one of all, where was Grandpa Joe now? Had he gone to find his son? Was that why he disappeared? The journal didn't say. The last entry was abrupt, just a few weeks before he vanished. I have to know. I have to see him. For Anneliese's sake and for mine. But that wasn't even the half of it, because then Professor Davies said, "There's one more thing, Mr. Henderson. A small, folded piece of paper tucked into the back cover of the journal. It's a plane ticket. One way, to Berlin, dated for the day after he disappeared." My God, he hadn't just wandered off. He'd planned this, he'd left. He'd gone to Germany. But what or who was he expecting to find there after all this time? And why the secrecy, even now? The old man was full of more twists than a pretzel, and I had a sinking feeling the biggest ones were yet to come. A one-way ticket to Berlin. My Grandpa Joe, or Joseph Gruber as I was now learning to think of him, at 101 years old, had hopped on a transatlantic flight to chase a ghost from his past. Lord have mercy, the man had more gumption than sense sometimes. Or maybe, just maybe, he had a really good reason. Klaus is alive. Those words from the journal echoed in my mind. His son, my uncle, half-uncle. The family tree was getting more complicated than a tax form. "We have to go," Michael said, his voice firm. "We have to find him, Dad, and meet this Klaus if he's real." Susan, my wife, who'd been a rock through all this, just nodded. She knew there was no arguing. This was something we had to do, not just for Grandpa Joe, but for ourselves, for the truth of our family. Sarah was more hesitant. "What if he doesn't want to be found by us?" she worried. "What if this Klaus, what if he's not good?" It was a fair question. We were stepping into a hornet's nest of unknowns. But the thought of my 101-year-old grandfather alone in a foreign country, possibly frail, possibly confused, spurred us on. The logistics were a nightmare, of course. Getting passports expedited, booking last-minute flights to Berlin. It cost king's ransom, I tell you. But 2 days later, Michael and I were on a plane, leaving Susan and Sarah to hold down the fort and liaise with Professor Davies, who was still painstakingly translating any remaining scraps of paper from that Pandora's box of a suitcase. The flight was long, cramped, and I couldn't sleep a wink. My mind kept replaying scenes from Grandpa Joe's life, reevaluating every memory, every shared moment, through this new, distorted lens. Was he thinking of Anneliese when he looked out the window with that faraway expression? Was the sadness I sometimes saw in his eyes not just old age, but a lifelong grief for a lost family? We landed in Berlin, a city I'd only ever seen in war. Movies. It was bustling, modern, but with an undercurrent of history that felt heavy, palpable. We didn't even know where to start. The journal mentioned a lawyer's name, a Herr Vogel, but no address. Michael, bless his tech-savvy heart, managed to find a listing for a law firm, Vogel and Partners, with a quick search on his phone. It was a long shot, but it was all we had. The law office was in a stately old building that looked like it had seen a fair bit of history itself. A stern-looking secretary regarded us with suspicion when we asked for Herr Vogel, explaining in my broken high school German supplemented by Michael's slightly better grasp that we were looking for Joseph Gruber, an elderly American. She disappeared into an inner office, and after what felt like an eternity, a distinguished-looking man in his late 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes, emerged. This was Herr Vogel. He listened patiently as we stumbled through our story, showing him a photo of Grandpa Joe. His expression softened. Herr Gruber, he said in perfect English. Yes, I know him, or rather I know of him. It was I who contacted him on behalf of my client. My heart leaped. Your client? I asked. Is it Klaus? Herr Vogel smiled faintly. Indeed. Klaus Brandt. He is Herr Gruber's son. Brandt, not Gruber. He must have taken his mother's name or a stepfather's. Where are they? Michael pressed. Can we see them? Is my grandfather okay? Herr Vogel held up a hand. Please, gentlemen. Come into my office, there is much to explain. He led us into a book-lined room and gestured for us to sit. Joseph, your grandfather, arrived here a little over a week ago. He is a remarkable man for his age. He is currently staying with Klaus and his family, a little way outside the city. Relief washed over me, so potent it nearly buckled my knees. He was safe. He was with his son. Klaus, Herr Vogel continued, only discovered the truth of his paternity a year ago. His mother, Anneliese. He paused, and my breath caught in my throat. Anneliese passed away 10 years ago. She never remarried. She raised Klaus on her own, telling him his father had died a hero in the war. It was only after her death, when Klaus was going through her belongings, that he found a hidden cache of letters. Letters from Joseph Gruber, his father, and a photograph of him as a young soldier. It was the mirror image of our discovery. Two sides of a hidden story, separated by an ocean and 70 years of silence. Anneliese believed Joseph had died, Herr Vogel explained. She'd been told his unit was wiped out. She searched after the war, but with Germany in chaos, and with Joseph having emigrated and changed his name. It was impossible. She grieved him, just as he grieved her. A tragedy of errors and misinformation fueled by war. Lord, the senseless waste of it all. Two people loving each other, torn apart by circumstance, each believing the other lost forever. Klaus spent months trying to trace Joseph Gruber, Vogel said. It was a difficult search, but eventually, through various international genealogical services and a bit of luck, we found a record of a Joseph Gruber immigrating to the U.S., and then the trail went cold with the name change. It was the mention of Pennsylvania in one of Joseph's old letters to Anneliese that gave us a lead. We eventually found a Joseph Henderson with the right birth year, who had a wife named Rose, a name Joseph had also mentioned fondly in a letter, a kind woman who had helped him. We took a chance and wrote to him, and Grandpa Joe, or Joseph, had responded. He'd flown across the world to meet the son he thought he'd lost forever. They are getting to know each other, Herr Vogel said carefully. It is emotional, as you can imagine. For Klaus, meeting the father he never knew. For Joseph, discovering his son is alive and that he has grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren here in Germany. More family. An entire German branch we never knew existed. Herr Vogel gave us the address. It was a farmhouse in the countryside, about an hour's drive. He offered to call ahead, but I asked him not to. I don't know what I wanted. Maybe to see it for myself, unannounced, unfiltered. We rented a car, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. What would this Klaus be like? Would he resent us, the American family who'd had his father all these years? Would Grandpa Joe even want to see us now that he'd found this missing piece of his heart? We pulled up to a charming rustic farmhouse, smoke curling from the chimney. It looked peaceful, idyllic, a world away from the turmoil in my soul. As we got out of the car, the front door opened. A man stood there, tall, in his late 70s, I reckoned, with a shock of white hair and eyes so piercingly blue they could only belong to one family. My grandfather's eyes. He looked from me to Michael, a questioning look on his face. Then, from behind him, a frail, stooped figure emerged, leaning heavily on a cane. It was Grandpa Joe. He saw us. His eyes, those familiar faded blue eyes, widened. For a moment he just stared. Then a slow smile spread across his wrinkled face, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. "Frankie," he said, his voice reedy but clear. "Michael, what in the blue blazes are you boys doing here?" The man beside him, Klaus, looked at us. Then, at Grandpa Joe, a dawning understanding on his face. He stepped forward, extending a hand, first to me, then to Michael. His grip was firm. "So," he said, his English accented but clear, "you are my American brothers, yes?" Brothers. The word hung in the air. It wasn't what I expected. There was no animosity, no suspicion, just a weary, hopeful curiosity. And then Klaus turned to me, his gaze direct, and said something that nearly knocked me off my feet. "My father. He has told me so much about your grandmother, Rose. He said she saved his life, gave him a reason to live again. He loved her very, very much, just as he loved my mother, Annalise. He said it so simply, so honestly. And in that moment, a lifetime of confused emotions began to settle. This wasn't about betrayal. It was about survival, about love found in the ruins, and about secrets kept not out of malice but out of unbearable pain, and a belief that the past was truly dead. But, as we were all learning, the past has a funny way of never staying buried for long. And I had a feeling the biggest surprises were still in store, especially concerning what Grandpa Joe planned to do next. Standing there on the porch of that German farmhouse, it felt like the world had tilted and then righted itself, but everything looked different. Grandpa Joe, or Joseph as I was now trying to think of him in this new context, shuffled towards that familiar twinkle in his eye, albeit a little dimmer now. "Well, don't just stand there gawking like a couple of city slickers seeing a cow for the first time," he cackled, though it was weaker than his usual robust laugh. Come on in, meet the rest of the clan." The rest of the clan was a revelation. Klaus, it turned out, had a warm, welcoming wife named Greta, 2 grown children, a son, Stefan, and a daughter, Lena, and 3 rambunctious grandkids, who immediately took a shine to Michael, probably because he let them play games on his phone. It was surreal. Here we were, the American Hendersons suddenly embraced by the German Brandts, 2 families spun from the same thread. Joseph Gruber. We spent the rest of that day, and the next few, in a whirlwind of introductions, shared stories, and surprisingly, easy laughter. Greta served hearty German food, strong coffee, and delicious cakes, and despite the language barrier with the grandkids, warmth and curiosity bridged the gap. Klaus was a good man, quiet, thoughtful, with his father's gentle eyes and a reserved strength. He'd been a history teacher before he retired. He showed us photographs of Annalise, a woman who looked both strong and fragile, her beauty tinged with a sadness that now made a painful kind of sense. He spoke of her with deep love and respect. He told us how she'd never stopped missing Joseph, how she'd kept his memory alive for Klaus, even if it was a carefully edited version. There was no bitterness in him, only a profound sense of wonder at this late-in-life discovery. He'd found his father, and in doing so, an entire new family. Grandpa Joe, well, he seemed lighter. Like a burden he'd carried for over 70 years had finally been set down. He sat in a comfortable armchair by the fire, Klaus often by his side, and he talked. Oh, how he talked. He told us stories about his youth in Germany, about meeting Annalise, about the war, things he'd never breathed a word of back home. He spoke of his love for Grandma Rose, how she'd been his anchor, his safe harbor after the storm of his early life. He confessed he'd always meant to tell her the whole truth, but the time never seemed right, and then it was too late. "I was a coward, Frankie," he said to me one evening, his voice thick with emotion. "A coward about that. Rosie, she deserved better than a man with half a heart hidden away. She knew you loved her, Grandpa," I said, and I believed it. "And I think she would have understood. Maybe she even suspected. Women have a way of knowing things, you know." He just nodded, a tear tracing a path down his wrinkled. "Jugi, the question of what happened to the money orders Herr Fogel had mentioned Grandpa Joe sending came up. Klaus explained, "My mother received anonymous support for many years after the war. Small amounts, but regular. Enough to make a difference. She always thought it was from a distant relative or a charity. It seems it was Father finding a way to help even when he thought she was gone, perhaps for other survivors or a memorial fund he thought existed. And somehow, it reached her through the chaos of post-war bureaucracy. It was another piece of the puzzle, showing Grandpa Joe's enduring, if indirect, attempt to care for those he'd lost. And the suitcase? What was inside that was so heavy?" Grandpa Joe chuckled. "Ah, that old thing. Well, after Annalise and Klaus disappeared, I started collecting things. Not just their letters and photos, but reparations. Small payments I received over the years for certain losses during the war, and some savings. I never trusted banks much after everything went sideways in Germany back in the 30s, so I kept it in there. Figured if I ever found them or their descendants, it would be theirs." He looked at Klaus. "It is yours, son, and your family's. A small token from a foolish old man." Klaus shook his head. "Papa," he said, using the German endearment, "the only treasure is having you here, knowing our story." But Grandpa Joe was insistent when we eventually went back to the States with him, because yes, he agreed to come back with us for a while, after much persuasion and promises of regular video calls with his newfound German family. That suitcase came too. And when it was finally opened again back in his little house on Elm Street, which we'd aired out and cleaned, there it was. Not millions, not like some gangster movie, but a significant amount of old currency carefully wrapped and some gold coins. Enough to give Klaus and his family some security, a tangible piece of their father's and grandfather's complicated legacy. The real inheritance, though, was the truth and the connections we'd all made. Grandpa Joe lived for another 6 months after our trip to Germany. He passed away peacefully in his sleep, back in his own bed on Elm Street. But this time, he wasn't alone. Michael and I were there, and Sarah. And thanks to the wonders of modern technology, Klaus, Greta, and their family were there too, on a video call, sharing stories and goodbyes across the miles. His two families, united at last. It was a hell of a thing. Discovering my quiet grandpa was a German war veteran named Joseph, with a secret first family. It shook everything I thought I knew to its core. But in the end, it didn't diminish the man I loved. It just made him more complex, more human, more heartbreakingly real. He wasn't a saint, but he was a survivor. A man who'd loved deeply and lost terribly and then found the courage to love again. He made choices, some born of desperation, some of fear, but ultimately he tried to do right by the people he cared about, in his own flawed, human way. The two families, the Hendersons and the Brants, we're still in touch. We visit. They visit. The grandkids are learning each other's languages. It's a strange, beautiful, messy, wonderful thing, this expanded family of ours, born from secrets and war and a love that somehow endured it all. And it all started with a 101-year-old man disappearing and a mysterious suitcase. Life, eh? It's got more twists and turns than a country road. So, what do you think? Could you ever imagine your own family having a secret this big buried in the past? Let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this old man's rambling tale, do me a favor and hit that like button, and maybe even subscribe for more stories from a life that's seen a thing or two. You just never know what skeletons might be rattling in the family closet.